How are you guys doing? Today is Monday, March 22nd, 2021, out here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do a GOAT, greatest of all time, profile on J.J. Watt, the newest defensive end for the Arizona Cardinals, who today is turning 32 years old. And with this episode of The Elite, my intention is to let his accomplishments and his accolades and everything that he's done over his career speak for themselves rather than having me make some argument to persuade many as to why he is elite. If you are unaware of J.J. Watt, he's one of the most dynamic defensive players that the NFL has ever seen. He's 6'5", 288, literally built like a refrigerator. He's incredibly fast, very agile. He's very smart. He can read plays, and he just overpowers offensive linemen who are literally built to stop men his size. And he always finds a will. He always finds a way. And not to mention, he's a Walter Payton Man of the Year because of I think he was a Walter Payton Man of the year that Houston had the hurricane, and he stepped up and he did a lot that he really didn't have to do, but the fact that he actually went out and did it, it shows more than words could ever say. So just to give a little bit of background on J.J. Watt, he's from Wisconsin. He would eventually go to the University of Wisconsin as a walk-on. He started originally as a tight end, but then he would find himself, because he went to Central Michigan, and then he walked on to Wisconsin, and then he bulked up, went to the defensive side of the ball, and then as a sophomore, because of course he was a redshirt because he had to take the year, he would end up with 44 tackles in his first season after playing 13 seasons in 2009 in Wisconsin, where they finished with a 10-3 record. They ended up winning the Champs Sports Bowl versus Miami. They finished around the middle of the pack, but still J.J. Watt in his sophomore year he still had 4.5 sacks in the Big Ten, establishing himself as one of the better players as a defensive end. And you'd see the change, you see the turn for him come his junior year at Wisconsin, where he would start all 13 games in a season where Wisconsin would finish with an 11-2 record. They tied for the best record in the Big Ten. They would end up losing to the Horned Frogs in the Rose Bowl, or TCU, if you don't know who the Horned Frogs are. And then J.J. Watt that season would end up with a total of 62 tackles as a defensive end, which is incredibly good, especially in the Big Ten. His tackles for losses went up from 15.5 to 21, which is a lot of tackles for losses. Of course, when we're talking about Big Ten O-linemen, 7 sacks. He had an interception as well. So, of course, and he also put up an incredible combine. He's just an incredibly gifted athlete, and of course he worked to bulk himself up. He would be named first team All Big Ten, first team All American, and he would establish himself as a good enough prospect to be taken with the 11th overall pick in the 2011 NFL Draft, which was a very star-studded NFL draft. Featured players such as Cam Newton, Von Miller, A.J. Green, Patrick Peterson, Julio Jones. Those are players that were picked ahead of him in that very draft. So just to get a sense of where he was in that amazing draft class, he was there. And he would get his start, and he would play his entire career in the city of Houston, at least up until now. In 2011, his very first season in Houston, his age 22 season, he would start all 66 games in a season where the Houston Texans would finish with a 10-6 record. They would go on to make the playoffs, and this would be Gary Kubiak's probably 6th season with the team. This is a very good squad. In this year, Watt he would finish with 56 total tackles on the year, which is between about 3 and 4. 13 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks as a rookie. He didn't really make the rookie team, but he was still one of the best young players in football. But this would be right before the next year, before he would flip a switch, and then he would cross a threshold in which he would never come back. In his very second year in the NFL, in his age 23 season in 2012 with the Houston Texans, he will go on to start all 16 games for the second year in a row in a season where the Houston Texans would finish with a 12-4 record. And this was after they finished with two more wins than they did the previous season, and then going back to how Watt did. Those 16 games, he would finish with 81 tackles on the season as a defensive end. He finished with 20 and a half sacks, which is it's the most he's ever had in his career. He's done that twice, but he had 20 and a half sacks, along with 16 passes defended, 4 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries as well. And he also led the NFL in tackles for losses for the very first time in his career as well. He would go on to be named a Pro Bowler. He would be named first team All-Pro. And along with being the NFL sacks leader, he would go on to be named the NFL Defensive Player of the Year for the very first time in his career in his second year in the NFL, which is a crazy jump considering 2 years ago he was barely even a top 10 pick in the 2011 draft, which is a great draft, but still. That incredible jump, I think, is what ascended him to at least put him in contention for being one of the greatest players of all time. And then right after that, he would just continue his excellence. But going into that playoff season, they would go on to beat the Bengals in the wild card, and then they would end up getting smoked by the Patriots in the season that the Ravens would end up beating the 49ers in the playoffs, just to give a sense of where the Texans were in that sense. In J.J. Watt's third season with the Houston Texans, in his age 24 season, he would start all 16 games, who start all 16 games in a season where the Texans would finish with a 2-14 record. They ended up switching coaches from Gary Kubiak to Wade Phillips as they were looking for Bill O'Brien. And what would be their worst season in franchise history, except for maybe 2005, where they ended up with the number 1 pick the next year. But, I continue. I'm not going to... But in 2013, he would start all 16 games. He would finish with 80 tackles on the season, the second most tackles he'd ever put up in a season to his second season. And then he would put up 10 and a half sacks. The second time in his career, he put up double-digit sacks in a season. He would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the second time in his career. He would be named to the first team All-Pro for the second time in his career. And once again, the accolades were continuing to add up. And the next year, J.J. Watt would just continue just to get better and better. In 2014, his fourth year in the league, J.J. Watt would start all 16 games in a season where the Texans would finish with a 9-7 record, a 7-win increase from the previous year in Bill O'Brien's very first season as head coach. And they would go on, like I said, they would go on to make the playoff, or they would go on and miss the playoffs, but just barely. In this season, J.J. Watt would put up 78 tackles, which is on par to what he did the last couple of seasons, let alone he did this as a defensive end. Defensive ends usually don't get 5 tackles a game for an entire NFL season. He finished with 4 forced fumbles for the third year in a row. This time he had 5 fumble recoveries, the most fumble recoveries he's ever had in a season in his career. He had a fumble recovery touchdown for the only time in his career. He didn't lead the league this year, but he still had 20 and a half sacks. This is the second time in his career he's ever done that. The first time was in 2012. He's never put up that many sacks in a season ever since then. He would also go on to lead the league in tackles for losses with 29. And with this, even though the Houston Texans would not make the playoffs, J.J. Watt would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the third time in his fourth season in the league. He would be named a first team All-Pro defensive end for the third time in his career up until that point. And he would also be named the NFL Defensive Player of the Year for the second time in his NFL career, which is insane. And just the fact that in his first 4 years in the league, he could have just retired and been a Hall of Famer right then and there says enough for his career. And I think that is what, of course, would have given him an elite profile more above and beyond. But I think his next year is what cemented him as one of the greatest players of all time. So in 2015, his fifth year in the NFL, like I'm remember, we're keeping track, fifth year in the NFL, his age 26 season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Houston Texans would go 9-7, same record as the year before, except this time they actually won their division. And this year, J.J. Watt would finish with 76 tackles, the least amount of tackles out of the 4 years since he's been a Pro Bowler. He would finish with 17.5 sacks, leading the NFL in sacks. He led the league in tackles for losses for the third time in his career. He had 29 of them. The second time he put up 29 in a 16-game season. He would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the fourth year in a row. He was named first team All-Pro for the fourth year in a row, and he was named the NFL Defensive Player of the Year for the third time in a 4-year span, which of course I think that itself put him in the GOAT category, and I think he's really kind of been up there ever since because he's still the same player. But he would continue to show on the field that even though the Houston Texans weren't that great of a team, he individually could change the outcome of a game. And looking at to how they did that season, they would go on to lose 30-0 in the wild card to the Chiefs, and that's when Alex Smith was the quarterback. But of course, that would be the last NFL Defensive Player of the Year that J.J. Watt has won to date. But that would transition into his next couple years that were definitely plagued with injury. 2016, he had to go under back surgery for a herniated disc. And so he had to deal with that. And then in 2017, he had to deal with a tibial plateau fracture in his left leg. So in 2015 and 16, he played a combined 8 games. Maybe he had 23 tackles in those games, but of course he wasn't fully himself. 2016 and 17, these were seasons that in 2016, the Texans did go on to make the playoffs. They beat the Raiders, but they lost to the Patriots that year in 2017. J.J. Watt, even though he would go on to play not 5 games that season, he would go on to be named the Walter Payton Man of the Year for what he was doing with hurricane relief in Houston. And that's what's known as the NFL's the NFL refers to it as his most prestigious honor for excellence on and off the field. And of course, J.J. Watt being doing what he did for the city of Houston, of course, it makes sense. And that, of course, has made him a legend in the city of Houston, even though he decided to leave for Phoenix just not that long ago. But that was the most recent NFL award that J.J. Watt has won he has 3 Defensive Player of the Years and a Walter Payton Man of the Year to hang up in his trophy case. And this would transition into his next full season with Houston in 2018. He would start all 16 games in a season where the Houston Texans would make the playoffs. They would finish with an 11-5 record, and then J.J. Watt in this season, in those 16 games, the first time he played a 16-game season since the year he won the Defensive Player of the Year for the third time. He would finish with 61 tackles, which is lower than he put up those other years, but is still an incredibly high amount for a defensive end. And he still put up 16 sacks, which is the 4th highest amount of sacks he put up, but he played 16 games. He averaged 1 sack a game. Defensive ends don't do that. Of course, that's why he's GOATed. Because at first, you never know when a player just can't come back. J.J. Watt came back with that performance. He would also go on to lead the NFL in forced fumbles. He had 7 of them. He has never done that in his own career, so that's a career high of his own. That would be an elite feat, a GOAT feat in that. And he would just have an amazing year just around the board. And he would go on to make the Pro Bowl yet again, and he would be named first team All NFL for the 5th time in his career. So for half of a decade of his NFL career. You can pick up half a decade of years in his career in which he was regarded as the best, if not the best, the second best at his position in the NFL. That is why he has a GO profile at 32 years old. But of course, I'll continue. Once the Houston Texans made the playoffs, they would go on to lose to the Colts 21-7. But still, JJ had one heck of a year, going out to or transitioning into his next year in 2019. 2019 was a year that was kind of riddled with injury too. He only played 8 games that year. He finished with 4 sacks, 24 combined tackles in a season where the Texans would still go on to make the playoffs in Bill O'Brien's last full season. They beat the Bills in overtime, and then they would end up losing to the Chiefs in the divisional round after the Texans had actually built up kind of a lead, but of course they would run away with it. But he would end up leaving because he tore a pectoral in about week 8. It was in week 8 against the Raiders, if I remember that correctly. But he would come back this most recent season in 2020, and in his last season with Houston, he would start all 16 games yet again. Which is this would be the 7th season in his 10-year career in which he's played all 16 games of the season. And in 2020, the Houston Texans would end up going 4-12. Yet another bad season since he's been there. Kind of caught a tough break, and then of course it was the second time that it happened in a head coach transitional period for Houston. But amidst all of it, in the 16 games he played, he finished with 52 tackles. He had only 5 sacks on the season, but he still had about 14 tackles for loss, 7 passes defended, 2 forced fumbles. He was still very much getting in there because I feel like getting over a torn pectoral will take a bit. And now over this break, he has had a chance to get a new change of scenery. And going into this new season, he is now 32, one of the greatest NFL players to ever play the game. He has 7 full seasons within a 10-year career. He's won the Defensive Player of the Year 3 times. He's been named a Pro Bowler 5 times. He's been named First Team All-Pro 5 times. He's led the league in sacks twice. He's had at least 20 sacks in the league twice. He has at least 100 sacks to his name. And this is after being this is after being like a player that had to be a tight end at Central Michigan and then had to switch to Wisconsin, had to completely switch his position around. The fact that he's been able to build himself up to become one of the greatest football players this game has seen is just a testament to just a testament to his will, like his sheer willpower and then just ability just to get it done, alongside his winning the genetic lottery, alongside putting in a lot of hard work to maintain the frame that he has. And now he's going to be playing in Arizona, which is now starting to build up a squad. Now they because now they have Kyler Murray. They recently signed DeAndre Hopkins and AJ Green in the receiver core. They now have G.O.A.T. right opposite Chandler Jones, another defensive end that's dominated the 2010s, to give a sense of his current situation. With Buda Baker in the back, they also have Jordan Hicks and Isaiah Simmons, Robert Alford running through that Arizona defense. They're going to be a very tough defense to go up against, especially in the NFC West. And I just think with that said, I mean, from now on, his Houston Texans career is cemented. Now it's about time for him to get started with Arizona. And if you ever get a chance, watch the Milkman play with the Arizona Cardinals. He's currently wearing number 99, currently sitting out in the NFC West. He's going to be lined up against Russell Wilson, Jimmy Garoppolo, and not Jared Goff now, but Matthew Stafford now, twice a year, or for the next couple of years. So that's going to be very interesting. So I think with all that said, I think for the 2021 year, I think the numbers and the awards and the accolades say more than enough. But I think for 2021, he's definitely a player to keep your eye on. I'm definitely going to keep my eye on J.J. Watt in his first year in Phoenix. And he's just a good player to watch. You ever get a chance, he's a good, if you just love watching defensive players play, like, this man is a very powerful human being. He's one of the best defensive players I've ever seen in my life. I don't think I'll ever see one exactly like him. With that said, I want to thank everyone once again for listening to all 20 minutes of this piece. Today is Monday, March 22nd, 2021 in this quarantine. I'm James Sims. This is The Elite. I hope all is well, and thanks for staying along with the journey. Thanks for listening to my pieces, and peace out.